Sarah stared at Thomas as if he had spoken in a foreign language. You want to buy me coffee? I just tried to steal your medal. The medal you earned for saving lives in Afghanistan. Why would you want to help me? Thomas adjusted his red tunic, the weight of his military cross feeling different now that it had been temporarily lost and recovered. Because 6 years ago, I was in a similar place. Not financially, but emotionally. After I came back from Afghanistan, I was angry, lost, and making bad decisions. Someone helped me when they didn't have to. Maybe it's time to pass that forward. Colonel Harrison watched this exchange with growing admiration. In 4 decades of military service, he had seen young soldiers handle difficult situations with varying degrees of success. But Thomas's response showed a maturity and wisdom beyond his years. Guardsman Mitchell, the security officer, interjected, "Are you certain you don't want to press charges? Theft of military decorations is taken very seriously." Thomas looked at Sarah, who was still processing his unexpected offer. "I'm certain. This woman made a mistake, but she corrected it. That takes courage." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but for different reasons than before. "I don't understand. Why are you being kind to me? I don't deserve it." "Maybe not," Thomas replied honestly. "But deserving help and needing help are 2 different things. And right now, you seem to need help more than you need punishment." The crowd around them had thinned considerably, but Emma Mitchell had finally spotted her brother from across the courtyard. She approached with her 2 children in tow, both of them wide-eyed at seeing their uncle in his full ceremonial uniform. "Uncle Thomas," 8-year-old Sophie called out, running toward him with the uninhibited enthusiasm that only children possess. Thomas caught his niece in a hug, his stern guardsman facade melting instantly. "Hello, Princess. Did you see the ceremony?" "It was brilliant," 10-year-old James added, bouncing on his toes. "You looked proper serious, like a real soldier." "I am a real soldier," Thomas laughed, ruffling his nephew's hair. "Just one who wears a funny hat sometimes." Emma approached more cautiously, sensing the tension in the group of adults. "Thomas, is everything all right? We saw some commotion over here." Sarah watched this family interaction with a mixture of longing and pain. The easy affection between Thomas and his niece and nephew reminded her of what she had lost when her marriage ended. Her ex-husband had taken not just himself when he left, but also his children from his first marriage, who she had grown to love as her own. Thomas introduced his sister and the children to Colonel Harrison, who delighted them with stories about the ceremony and the history of the Guard. But Sarah noticed that Thomas didn't explain her presence, protecting her from awkward questions. "Emma, would it be all right if I met you back at the hotel in a couple of hours?" Thomas asked. "There's something I need to take care of first." His sister looked between Thomas and Sarah, her maternal instincts picking up on undercurrents she didn't fully understand. But she trusted her brother's judgment completely. "Of course. The children want to see the Tower of London anyway. We'll grab some lunch and meet you later." After they left, Colonel Harrison excused himself as well, but not before shaking Thomas's hand. "You're a credit to the service, lad. Your choice to show mercy reflects well on all of us." The security officer filed her report and departed, leaving Thomas and Sarah alone for the first time since the incident began. The morning crowd had largely dispersed, leaving them standing in the shadow of Buckingham Palace with the weight of an extraordinary situation between them. "I still can't believe you're offering to help me," Sarah said quietly. "This morning I was a desperate woman who stole from a war hero. Now that same war hero wants to buy me coffee. It doesn't make sense." Thomas began walking toward a small cafe he knew near St. James's Park, gesturing for her to follow. Maybe it doesn't have to make sense. Maybe sometimes the right thing to do is just obvious, even when it's unexpected. They walked in silence for several minutes, both processing the morning's events. Sarah found herself studying Thomas from the corner of her eye. Without the rigid posture required by ceremony, he moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. But she could see hints of the experiences that had shaped him, a slight favoring of his left leg that suggested an old injury, eyes that scanned their surroundings with automatic vigilance. The cafe Thomas chose was small and quiet, the kind of place that catered to locals rather than tourists. The elderly woman behind the counter recognized him immediately. "Tommy, haven't seen you in uniform for a while." Special occasion. Just finished the ceremony at the palace, Mrs. Patterson. Could we have 2 coffees and perhaps some of those biscuits the children always ask for? Of course, love. Find yourselves a table. They settled into a corner booth, and Thomas noticed Sarah looking around the cafe with genuine interest. This is lovely, she said. Very different from the corporate coffee chains I'm used to. Mrs. Patterson has run this place for 30 years. Her late husband was in the guards too. She's been feeding soldiers and their families for decades. Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, using its warmth to steady herself. Thomas, I need you to understand something. What I did today, it's not who I am. At least, it's not who I thought I was. I've spent my entire career in marketing, building campaigns about integrity and brand values. The irony of someone like me stealing from someone like you. It's almost too much to bear. Thomas sipped his coffee, studying her face. Tell me about your job. What did you do in marketing? I was a senior executive at a mid-sized agency. We handled campaigns for everything from luxury cars to charitable foundations. I was good at it too, really good. I understood how to reach people emotionally, how to make them care about products or causes. She paused, a bitter laugh escaping. I spent years crafting messages about doing the right thing, about companies that cared about their communities. And then, when my own life fell apart, the first thing I did was exactly the opposite of everything I'd ever promoted. Thomas leaned forward slightly. What happened with your job? The agency lost 3 major clients within 2 months. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. Market conditions changed, budgets got cut. But someone had to go, and despite having the best performance reviews in my department, I didn't have the political connections that some others did. Sarah's voice grew quieter. The worst part was that I saw it coming. I could feel the shift in how people treated me, the exclusion from certain meetings. But I thought my work would speak for itself. I thought merit mattered more than office politics. And your husband? Thomas asked gently. Richard. She said the name like it tasted bad. We met in university. Married 8 years next month. Or would have been. He's a solicitor, does quite well for himself. When I lost my job, he said he understood, that we'd get through it together. She took a shaky breath. 3 weeks later, I found out he was having an affair with his secretary, a 24-year-old secretary. When I confronted him, he said the job loss had shown him how different our life trajectories were becoming. Can you believe that? Life trajectories. Thomas could hear the pain beneath her anger. I'm sorry. Betrayal like that, it changes how you see everything. It does. Suddenly, I'm questioning every conversation we ever had, every decision we made together. Was he always this person? Was I just too naive to see it? And the practical aspects are even worse. He makes significantly more money than I did. But because we're both professionals, I won't get much in the divorce settlement. She gestured helplessly. The house we bought together. I love that house. We renovated it ourselves, spent weekends choosing paint colors and arguing about kitchen fixtures. But I can't afford the mortgage on my own, especially without a job. Richard knows this, and he's being completely unreasonable about the division of assets. Thomas listened without interrupting, recognizing the need for her to voice these frustrations. He had seen similar stress reactions in soldiers returning from deployment. The sense that everything stable had shifted without warning. The really maddening part, Sarah continued, is that Richard is painting himself as the victim to our mutual friends. Poor Richard, whose wife became unstable after losing her job. Poor Richard, who tried to make it work, but couldn't handle my emotional instability. Is that why you came to London? Thomas asked. Partly. I needed to get away from Manchester, from the house that doesn't feel like home anymore, from friends who are awkwardly choosing sides. I thought maybe a change of scenery would help me think clearly about what to do next. She laughed bitterly. Instead, I nearly became a criminal. I've never stolen anything in my life, not even office supplies from work. But this morning, I looked at your medal and saw a solution to my money problems, and my desperation overrode every moral principle I thought I had. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing her story. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. Sarah, can I tell you about the day I earned that medal? She nodded, grateful for the change of subject. It was a routine patrol in Kabul. My best mate Marcus and I were part of a team providing security for a humanitarian aid distribution. We'd done dozens of these missions. They felt safe, routine. The Taliban had been quiet in that area for weeks. Thomas's eyes grew distant. The explosion came from nowhere. A suicide bomber had gotten through our perimeter somehow. Marcus and I were knocked down by the blast, separated from the rest of our unit. When I got my bearings, I realized the bomber had targeted the aid station where civilians were waiting for medical supplies. Sarah listened intently, understanding that he was sharing something deeply personal. There were wounded people everywhere, men, women, children. Marcus and I started pulling people out of the rubble, getting them to safety. But the building was unstable, and we could hear secondary explosions from inside. Marcus went back for an elderly woman who couldn't walk. I was supposed to go with him, but I was helping carry a wounded child to the medics. Thomas's voice grew quieter. The building collapsed while Marcus was inside. We got the woman out, but Marcus, we couldn't reach him in time. 12 civilians lived because of what we did that day, but Marcus died because I let him go back alone. Sarah felt her breath catch. Thomas, that wasn't your fault, wasn't it? We were supposed to work together, watch each other's backs. I made a choice to help the child instead of backing up my partner. The medal says I'm a hero, but heroes don't let their best friends die. You saved 13 people that day, Sarah said firmly, including Marcus's rescue. That woman lived because he was brave enough to go back for her. Thomas met her eyes. Maybe, but the point is, that medal represents the worst day of my life as much as the best. When you took it, you weren't just taking a piece of metal worth money. You were taking the physical reminder of everyone I saved and everyone I lost. Sarah felt fresh tears coming. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. You couldn't have known. But that's why I want to help you, Sarah. When I came back from Afghanistan, I was carrying guilt and anger that I didn't know how to handle. I made some terrible decisions, drinking too much, pushing away people who cared about me, nearly throwing away my military career. He leaned back in his chair. A chaplain at the base saw what was happening and basically forced me into counseling. He said something I'll never forget. Hurt people, but healed people heal people. You're hurting right now, and that hurt led you to make a choice you'd never normally make. But I still made that choice, Sarah protested. Yes, you did. And then you unmade it. That takes character, Sarah. Real character. The question now is what you're going to do next. Sarah stared into her coffee, overwhelmed by his kindness and insight. I don't know what to do next. I've never felt so lost in my life. Thomas pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. I might have some ideas about that. Tell me, what kind of marketing work did you enjoy most? Honestly, the campaigns for charitable organizations. The pay wasn't as good as corporate work, but the satisfaction was incredible. Knowing that my strategies were helping worthy causes raise money and awareness, that felt meaningful. Good, Thomas smiled. Because I know someone who might be very interested in meeting you. 3 hours later, Sarah found herself in the offices of Heroes Haven, a charity that provided support services for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. The organization's founder, Maria Santos, had served 2 tours in Iraq before starting the nonprofit 5 years earlier. Thomas called me about you, Maria said, settling behind her desk with tea for both of them. He said you're someone with excellent marketing skills who's facing a difficult transition herself. Sarah looked around the office, which was filled with photos of veterans who had been helped by the organization. He told you what happened this morning. He told me that you made a mistake and corrected it, which shows good character under pressure. He also said you're passionate about using marketing for meaningful causes. Maria leaned forward. I'm going to be direct with you, Sarah. We need someone with real marketing experience to help us expand our reach. We're helping hundreds of veterans, but we could be helping thousands if we could better communicate what we do and why it matters. I'd love to help, Sarah said immediately. But I should be honest. I'm going through a difficult divorce, and I need to find stable employment fairly quickly. I understand. The position would start as contract work. We can't afford a full-time marketing director yet. But the pay is decent, and if you can help us grow our donor base, it could become permanent. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope. What would you need from me? Everything, Maria laughed. Website redesign, social media strategy, donor communications, event planning, media relations. We're a small team doing important work, but we're terrible at telling our story. As they discussed the details, Sarah found herself energized in a way she hadn't been since losing her previous job. This wasn't just employment. It was a chance to use her skills for something that truly mattered. When she finally left the Heroes Haven office, Sarah felt like a different person than the desperate woman who had grabbed Thomas's medal that morning. She had work again, meaningful work that aligned with her values. But, more than that, she had been reminded that people could choose kindness even when they had every right to choose anger. Thomas was waiting outside the building, having changed from his ceremonial uniform into civilian clothes. "How did it go?" "I think you may have just saved my life," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just my career, my faith in people, my faith in myself." "You saved yourself," Thomas replied. "When you chose to return that medal, you proved you're someone worth helping." They walked together toward the underground station, the London afternoon bustling around them. Sarah kept thinking about the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. The desperation that led to a terrible choice, the courage of strangers who chose to help rather than punish, and the unexpected kindness of the man she had wronged. "Thomas," she said as they reached the station entrance, "I want you to know that I'll never forget what you did for me today. And I promise you, I'll spend the rest of my career making sure that veterans like you get the respect and support you deserve." Thomas smiled. "Just promise me one more thing. Anything. Promise me that when you meet someone else who's desperate and making bad choices, you'll remember that sometimes people need help more than they need judgment." Sarah nodded, understanding that this was more than a request, it was a responsibility. Today she had learned that redemption was possible, that mistakes didn't have to define a person's entire story. But with that redemption came the obligation to extend the same grace to others. As Thomas disappeared into the underground and Sarah walked toward her hotel, she felt the weight of the morning's events settling into something like wisdom. She had awakened that day as someone who could steal from a war hero. She was ending it as someone who understood that the measure of a person wasn't their worst moment, but what they chose to do after it. The military cross remained pinned to Thomas's dress uniform back at his barracks, but its real value had been proven that day not in bronze and ribbon, but in the demonstration that honor, once nearly lost, could be redeemed through courage, kindness, and the willingness of good people to believe in second chances. 6 months later, Sarah would send Thomas a photo from Heroes Haven's most successful fundraising gala ever, an event that raised enough money to help 50 more veterans transition successfully back to civilian life. She would tell him that every veteran they helped was a reminder of the kindness he had shown a desperate stranger on what could have been the worst day of her life. But that morning at Buckingham Palace, as Sarah walked away from the scene of her near disaster, she simply knew that she had learned something profound about the nature of human character, both her own and that of others. She had discovered that redemption was always possible, but only for those brave enough to reach for it when it was offered. The morning Sarah's hand trembled as she stared at the bronze cross. The elderly veteran's calm persistence and the growing crowd of disapproving faces created a pressure she had never experienced before. She had made marketing presentations to hostile boards of directors, but this was different. These people weren't judging her quarterly projections, they were judging her character. "Please, miss," the elderly man said more gently. "I served 40 years in Her Majesty's forces. I know what that medal means to the lad who earned it. It's not about the money, it's about honor." Around them, Sarah could hear fragments of conversations as words spread through the crowd. Someone was explaining to their children what had happened, using it as a teaching moment about right and wrong. A group of tourists were taking photos. The weather of the ceremony or the unfolding drama, she couldn't tell. The security personnel were getting closer now. Sarah could see their yellow vests moving through the crowd, following the direction pointed by helpful bystanders. In a few moments, this would escalate beyond her control. The choice between returning the medal voluntarily and being arrested for theft was measured in seconds, not minutes. Thomas watched the scene unfold from his position in formation, his training warring with his emotions. The changing of the guard ceremony was reaching its final moments, but he was completely focused on the woman holding his military cross. He could see her internal struggle playing out across her face, the desperation that had driven her to steal it battling against what appeared to be a functioning conscience. From his position, Thomas could see things the crowd couldn't. The woman's clothes were expensive but worn, suggesting someone who had once been well off but had fallen on hard times. Her posture spoke of exhaustion and defeat. She wasn't a career criminal. She was someone who had made a desperate mistake. The ceremony concluded with its traditional precision, but instead of the usual dispersal, the guardsmen were ordered to remain in formation while the situation was resolved. Thomas's commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, had been discreetly briefed about the theft and was coordinating with security to handle the matter appropriately. Sarah looked once more at the medal in her palm. Up close, she could see the intricate details of the military cross, the crown, the cipher, the ribbon. But, more than that, she could see scratches and were marks that spoke of a medal that was actually worn, actually valued, not kept in a display case. This was someone's most treasured possession. The elderly veteran stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I can see you're in trouble, miss. We've all been there, times when everything goes wrong, and you can't see a way out. But this isn't the way. This young man earned that medal saving lives. You don't want to be the person who took that from him." His words hit Sarah like a physical blow. In her desperation, she had focused only on the medal's potential value, not its personal meaning. She had convinced herself it was just a piece of metal, but standing here surrounded by veterans and their families, she couldn't maintain that fiction. "I lost my job," she whispered, not sure why she was telling this stranger her problems. "My husband left me. I'm going to lose my house. I thought maybe. Troubles pile up sometimes," the veteran replied with surprising kindness. "But stealing a man's honor won't solve them. And it'll create troubles you can't even imagine yet." Behind them, Sarah could hear the security personnel getting closer. Their radios were crackling with updates, and she caught fragments about medal theft and detained for questioning. The window for voluntary resolution was almost closed. Thomas was thinking about his sister Emma and her children, who he knew were somewhere in this crowd. What kind of example was this setting for young Sophie and James? He hoped they were far enough away to avoid seeing this ugly scene. But he also hoped they might witness what happened next, whether this would end with redemption or arrest. The woman, he had begun thinking of her as a person rather than just the thief, was clearly struggling with her decision. Thomas found himself hoping she would do the right thing, not just because he wanted his medal back, but because he sensed that this moment would define something fundamental about who she was. Sarah closed her eyes again, and, in that darkness, she saw her life with brutal clarity. The job loss, the divorce, the financial problems, they were all temporary situations that could be overcome with time and effort. But the person she would become if she kept this medal, if she profited from someone else's sacrifice, that would be permanent. When she opened her eyes, she looked directly at Thomas for the first time. Even from across the formation, their eyes met, and she could see not anger but disappointment. It was somehow worse than fury would have been. This man, who had clearly faced real danger and real loss, was disappointed in her. "I'm sorry," she said, so quietly that only the veteran beside her could hear. "I'm so sorry." She extended her hand toward the elderly man, the medal resting on her open palm. Would you give this back to him?" "I can't. I'm too ashamed to face him." The veteran's expression softened completely. "That's the right choice, miss. And, yes, I'll see it gets back to him personally." As the elderly man took the medal, Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and loss. Relief that she had stepped back from a moral cliff edge, but loss because her original problems remained unsolved. If anything, they might be worse now. Word of this incident could spread, making her already difficult job search even harder. The security personnel finally reached them just as the medal changed hands. The lead officer, a stern-looking woman in her 40s, assessed the situation quickly. "I understand there was a theft here?" she asked, looking between Sarah and the veteran. "There was a misunderstanding," the elderly man replied carefully. "But it's been resolved. The medal is being returned to its rightful owner." Sarah looked at him in surprise. He was offering her a way out, a chance to avoid arrest and criminal charges. The kindness in his weathered face was almost too much to bear. The security officer looked skeptical. "Are you sure? We have multiple witness reports of someone taking a medal from one of the guardsmen." I'm Colonel Harrison, retired, the elderly man replied, his military bearing becoming more apparent. I can guarantee you that the situation has been handled appropriately. The young lady has learned from her mistake. The authority in his voice and the respect it commanded from the security officer gave Sarah a moment to breathe. But she realized she couldn't let this man cover for her completely. She had made the mistake. She needed to own it properly. I did take the medal, she said, her voice stronger now. I was desperate, and I made a terrible choice. But I'm returning it, and I want to apologize to the soldier I took it from. The security officer studied her carefully. You're admitting to theft? I'm admitting to making the worst mistake of my life, Sarah replied. And I want to make it right. Colonel Harrison smiled slightly. Officer, I think this young lady has learned a valuable lesson today. Perhaps we could arrange for a proper apology rather than charges. Thomas watched this exchange with growing amazement. He had expected anger, defiance, perhaps desperate excuses. Instead, he was witnessing something he rarely saw, genuine remorse, and a willingness to face consequences. Captain Reynolds approached Thomas's position. Guardsman Mitchell, you're dismissed to handle this matter. Report back for debrief in 1 hour. Thomas broke formation for the first time in the entire incident, his relief at being able to move and respond almost overwhelming. He walked toward the small group gathered around the woman who had taken his medal, his mind racing with things he wanted to say. As he approached, Sarah turned to face him directly for the first time. Up close, he could see that she had been crying, and her face showed the kind of exhaustion that came from more than just one difficult day. I'm Thomas Mitchell, he said simply. I believe you have something of mine. Colonel Harrison stepped forward with the medal. Guardsman Mitchell, this is yours. And this young lady has something to say to you. Sarah looked at Thomas, taking in the details she had missed during her panicked theft. He was younger than she had expected, probably close to her own age. His uniform was immaculate, but she could see stress lines around his eyes that suggested he had seen difficult things. Most importantly, she could see that he was waiting for her to speak, not demanding an apology but giving her space to offer one. I took your medal, she began, her voice shaking. I was desperate and scared, and I convinced myself it was just a piece of metal that could solve my problems. But I know now that it's so much more than that. It's your honor, your service, your sacrifice. I had no right to touch it, let alone take it. She paused, struggling with words that felt inadequate. I know saying sorry doesn't undo what I did, but I am truly, deeply sorry. And I want you to know that returning it was the easiest choice I've made in months. Thomas took the medal from Colonel Harrison, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. The bronze was slightly warm from Sarah's grip, and he could see where her fingers had smudged the polished surface. But it was undamaged, and more importantly, it was home. What's your name? He asked Sarah. Sarah Chun. Sarah, I appreciate your apology, and I can see that you mean it. I'm curious, though, what kind of problems could be so bad that this seemed like a solution? The question caught her off guard. She had expected anger, perhaps legal consequences, but not genuine interest in her situation. I lost my job 3 months ago, she said slowly. My husband left me for someone else. The divorce is costing me everything, and I'm about to lose my house. I came to London to escape for a few days, but I spent money I don't have, and when I saw your medal, I thought. She trailed off, realizing how hollow her reasoning sounded. You thought it might be valuable enough to help, Thomas finished. I understand desperation, Sarah. I've seen what it can make people do. Colonel Harrison listened to this exchange with growing interest. In his 40 years of service, he had learned to read people quickly, and he sensed that something important was happening here, something that went beyond simple crime and punishment. The small crowd that had gathered to watch the drama was beginning to disperse now that the immediate crisis was over. Some tourists had taken photos and were already moving on to the next site. But a core group remained, people who seemed invested in seeing how this story would end. Thomas pinned his medal back onto his tunic, the familiar ritual somehow more meaningful after its temporary absence. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. If you hadn't been caught, if this crowd hadn't forced you to return the medal, what would you have done? It was a brutal question, one that cut straight to the heart of her character. Sarah considered lying. offering the answer she thought he wanted to hear. But something about Thomas's directness and her own exhaustion with deception made honesty seem like the only option. "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to say I would have returned it on my own, but I was so desperate, so scared. I honestly don't know if I would have been strong enough to do the right thing without all of you forcing me to see what I was really doing." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's the most honest answer you could have given. And it's exactly why I'm going to do something that might seem crazy." Sarah looked at him with confusion, unsure what he could possibly mean. Around them, Colonel Harrison and the security officer waited with equal curiosity. "I want to buy you coffee," Thomas said. "And I want to hear more about these problems of yours. Because I think there might be better solutions than stealing medals." The offer hung in the air like something surreal. Sarah stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to what?" Sun cast long shadows across Westminster Bridge as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. At 28, he had served in the Queen's Guard for 6 years, but today felt different. Today marked exactly 5 years since the incident in Afghanistan that had changed everything. Thomas touched the metal pin to his chest, the military cross, awarded for exceptional gallantry during active operations. The bronze cross felt heavier than usual, carrying with it memories that still visited him in quiet moments. He had earned it during a mission that went terribly wrong, when his quick thinking had saved 12 civilians from a bombing in Kabul. But the cost had been high. His best friend Marcus hadn't made it home. The crowds were already gathering along the mall for the morning's ceremony. Thomas and his fellow guardsmen would march from Wellington Barracks to Buckingham Palace, where they would perform the changing of the guard. It was a routine he knew by heart, every step precisely choreographed, every movement practiced until it became second nature. Looking sharp, Mitchell called out Sergeant Williams as he inspected the line of soldiers. "Remember, thousands of tourists will be watching today. Make us proud." Thomas nodded, his mind drifting to his younger sister Emma, who would be watching from the crowd with her 2 children. She had driven down from Manchester specifically to see him perform the ceremony. After their father's death last year, Thomas had become the father figure for her kids, 8-year-old Sophie and 10-year-old James. They were fascinated by their uncle's uniform and the stories he carefully edited for their young ears. The march began precisely at 11:30. Thomas fell into step with his unit, their boots creating a rhythmic percussion on the pavement. The weight of his rifle, the familiar pressure of his bearskin hat, the stiff collar of his tunic, everything felt exactly as it should. This was his world, ordered and predictable. As they approached the palace, Thomas could see the crowd pressing against the barriers. Tourists held up phones and cameras, children sat on their parents' shoulders for better views, and tour guides pointed out details about the ceremony. It was a sea of faces, all looking toward the guardsmen with fascination and respect. Among the crowd, Sarah Chun was having the worst day of her life. At 35, she had built a successful career as a marketing executive, but 3 months ago, everything had started falling apart. First, her husband of 8 years had announced he was leaving her for his secretary, a cliché so painful it almost made her laugh. Then, her company had downsized, and despite her excellent performance record, she had been let go. The divorce proceedings were draining her savings, and her lawyer had just informed her that she might lose the house. Sarah had come to London to escape, using the last of her credit to book a weekend trip that she couldn't afford. She told herself it was necessary, a chance to clear her head and figure out what came next. But, standing in the crowd watching the ceremony, she felt more lost than ever. The guardsmen were impressive, she had to admit. Their precise movements and stoic expressions commanded attention. But what caught her eye was the glint of medals on their chests. Real medals, she realized. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers. They were veterans who had seen actual combat. One guardsman in particular drew her attention. He was tall with dark hair visible beneath his bearskin hat, and the way he carried himself suggested quiet confidence. More importantly, she could see the distinctive bronze cross of a military cross pinned to his tunic. Even from her position in the crowd, the medal seemed to catch the light. Sarah's mind began to race. She had heard that military medals, especially ones awarded for valor, could be worth significant money to collectors. With her financial situation so desperate, the thought of quick cash made her pulse quicken. She knew it was wrong. More than wrong. It was theft from someone who had clearly earned the honor through sacrifice. But desperation had a way of drowning out conscience. The ceremony continued with its ancient precision. Thomas and his fellow guardsmen moved through the complicated drill, their movements watched by hundreds of spectators. As they approached the final phase, where the old guard would be relieved by the new, Thomas noticed increased movement in the crowd. People were jostling for better positions, cameras were flashing, and the general excitement was building. That's when Sarah made her move. She had spotted a gap in the crowd control barriers, a place where the metal fencing didn't quite connect properly. During her years in marketing, she had developed sharp observational skills and an ability to spot opportunities others missed. This was definitely an opportunity, though not the kind she had ever imagined pursuing. Sarah squeezed through the gap, her heart pounding. She told herself she was just getting a better view, but she knew that wasn't true. The guardsmen were so focused on their ceremony that they weren't paying attention to individual crowd members. Their discipline, which usually impressed tourists, now worked in her favor. As Thomas's unit completed their final maneuver and came to attention, Sarah found herself just a few feet away from the formation. The guardsmen stood perfectly still, their eyes fixed straight ahead. This was her chance. Moving quickly but trying to appear casual, Sarah stepped forward and reached for Thomas's medal. Her fingers closed around the military cross, and, with a quick tug, she pulled it free from his tunic. The pin that held it came away cleanly, and, suddenly, she was holding the medal in her trembling hand. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Thomas felt the movement, but couldn't break formation to react. His training demanded that he remain motionless and silent regardless of distractions. But, inside, shock and anger were building like a pressure cooker. Sarah turned and began walking quickly back toward the crowd, the medal clutched in her fist. She had done it. She actually had done it. Her mind was already racing ahead to how she could sell it, how much money it might bring, how this could solve at least some of her immediate problems. But, as she moved away from the formation, something unexpected happened. She could hear murmurs from the crowd behind her, people pointing and talking in confused tones. Someone had seen what she had done. Did that woman just take something from the soldier? A voice asked in a clear British accent. I think she took his medal. Another person replied, louder this time. Sarah quickened her pace, but the crowd seemed to be turning against her. More people were pointing now, and she could hear the word medal being repeated. Her clever plan was falling apart with shocking speed. An elderly man in a military blazer covered with his own medals stepped directly into her path. His eyes were sharp and angry, and Sarah suddenly realized that many of the spectators were veterans themselves, people who would recognize immediately what she had done. Miss, I think you have something that doesn't belong to you, the elderly man said in a voice that carried clear authority. Sarah's face flushed red. The medal felt burning hot in her hand now, no longer a solution to her problems, but evidence of a terrible mistake. Around her, the crowd was becoming increasingly hostile. She could hear angry murmurs, and more people were moving to block her path. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, but her voice betrayed her guilt. That medal belongs to that guardsman, the elderly man continued. And, unless you return it immediately, this is going to become a much bigger problem for you. Behind them, the ceremony was continuing, but Sarah could sense that the situation was drawing attention from the officials overseeing the event. Security personnel were beginning to move through the crowd, alerted by the commotion. Thomas, still locked in formation, was fighting every instinct to break ranks and pursue the thief. The military cross wasn't just a piece of metal to him. It represented the most difficult day of his life, the day he had saved others but lost his best friend. It was Marcus's memory as much as his own honor. Sarah looked around desperately, realizing that she was surrounded by people who viewed her action as not just theft, but as an attack on something sacred. The weight of their disapproval was crushing, and, for the first time since she had grabbed the medal, she began to truly understand what she had done. The elderly veteran extended his hand. The right thing to do here is obvious, miss. Don't make this worse than it already is. Sarah stared at the medal in her hand, seeing it clearly for the first time. It wasn't just a piece of valuable metal. It was someone's most precious honor, earned through sacrifice she couldn't even imagine. The bronze cross felt heavier now than when she had first grabbed it, weighted with significance she had been too desperate to consider. Around her, the crowd waited. Behind her, the ceremony continued with its ancient dignity. But she knew that her impulsive action had set something in motion that couldn't be easily stopped. The question now wasn't whether she would be caught, but whether she would have the courage to do what was right before it was too late. The morning sun, which had started the day with such promise, now felt harsh and judgmental. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to summon the courage for what came next. When she opened them again, she found herself looking directly into the eyes of people who had served their country with honor, and she finally understood the true weight of what she had stolen. The elderly veteran's hand remained extended, patient but firm. The crowd around them had grown larger, and Sarah could sense that her window for making this right was rapidly closing. In the distance, she could see security personnel moving closer, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Thomas, still at attention but watching from the corner of his eye, found himself thinking about Marcus. What would his friend think of this moment? Marcus had always believed that people were fundamentally good, that even in the worst circumstances, most individuals would choose to do the right thing when given the chance. Sarah felt the weight of all those eyes upon her, the weight of her own conscience, and, most of all, the weight of the medal in her hand. Her financial problems hadn't disappeared, but somehow they seemed less important now than the choice she was about to make. The ceremony was reaching its conclusion, but everyone involved knew that the real drama was happening in the crowd, where a desperate woman was about to discover what kind of person she truly was when everything was stripped away except the choice between right and wrong.